Welcome, everybody. Great to see you here today. I think we're going to still have a few more people join us through the waiting room, but great to be with all of you, and we have a lot to cover today, so we'll get started. My name is Susie Brown, and I work at the Minnesota Council on Foundations in the role of president. I'm really pleased to be here with all of you today and our really incredible presenters on this program. It's good to be here on November 30th, which is the last day of Native American Heritage Month. And I want to honor our guests and participants here who are with us together on this important end of this important month, and also for this really important topic that we're going to discuss, which is how to support what it means to support land back initiatives in Minnesota. I want to just tell you a little bit about this partnership. This is a partnership between the Minnesota Council on Foundations and a group called We Are Still Here Minnesota, which you may hear referred to casually as WASH-MN through this event today. The people who we're working with We Are Still Here Minnesota include Joanne Stately from the Minneapolis Foundation, Sarah Hernandez from the McKnight Foundation, and Ramona Quito Stately, who is the project director for WASH-MN. This is a partnership that is bringing programming to MCF members around issues in Indian country, around funding for Native communities, around the issues that are important for us to learn about in philanthropy as it relates to our Native American community members in Minnesota. We have done 3 programs in the last year in partnership with WASH. This is the 4th, and we expect to bring another 3 programs to the MCF community next year. So tune in for those, watch for those in your MCF notes. We're really, really pleased to be a part of this partnership with WASH. We were really pleased to be invited to participate in raising awareness about these issues in the Minnesota philanthropic community. So with that, I will turn it over to Ramona, and she'll take it from here. Thanks, Ramona.
Thank you, Susie. Hami takuyapi. Ampetukinde owasi, chante washte anape chiusapye. Ramona Quito Stately emakiapie, damakota. De Dakota ia iupseyusewi mieye. Isayanti hechia tahawa hie takawana shakpe edwati. Hello, my relatives. My name is Ramona Quito Stately, and I am a citizen of the Isanti or Santi Dakota Nation, who currently live in exile from our original homeland here in Minnesota, Makoche. My people live in exile in Santee, Nebraska. But today I live in our original homeland here. So as an Asante Dakota woman, my foundational identity is reflected in the phrase I used, mitakuye owasi. And that is not only a standard Dakota greeting, but within our language, it continually transmits knowledge to generations about our spiritual lifeways and philosophies of how to live. So the translation is, all of life is my relative. So this greeting acknowledges not just you today in this webinar, but it acknowledges the natural world, the sky and the earth, and all forms of life. So all forms of life are considered sacred because each has a spirit and each fulfills a special purpose. So as the project director of We Are Still Here Minnesota, I want to say thank you for being here. We Are Still Here Minnesota is a community or network of Native American leaders in education, governance and policy, media, pop culture, and philanthropy, working together with our allies to identify and deconstruct narratives that are harmful to Native American people. We Are Still Here Minnesota affirms the resiliency of Native peoples throughout our region, and we stand committed to rebuilding systems that support Native families, communities, and nations now and into the future. So today is a really exciting opportunity to gather with you all today and to share our living history and what it means to support land back initiatives in Minnesota. These events that we've planned today allow us to build relationships. So I appreciate being in the presence of all of you today and for taking the time to experience a more authentic history of the Native nations in Minnesota. So I wanted to offer a land acknowledgement. And in Dakota, we say Dakota Kinde, Dakota Tamakoje. And that really is a short phrase of acknowledging that this is the land of the Dakota people. And when we say it in the Dakota language, which is the oldest language in Minnesota, it's the language that is codified. Within that language, we learn about place. And so by acknowledging it in such a short phrase, it is just acknowledging that not only are the people important, the land is important, but the language as well. So I wanted to introduce to you our two task force chairs for the We Are Still Here Minnesota's philanthropy group. And the first is Sarah Hernandez. You guys, she's our co-chair for the, but you guys probably know her as McKnight's program officer for the Vibrant and Equitable Communities program. She works to advance the program's goal to build vibrant and equitable future for all Minnesotans with shared power, prosperity, and participation. And then the other co-chair is Joanne Stately, who's also going to moderate for us today. But she serves as the co-chair of We Are Still Here, Minnesota's philanthropy task force. So you may know Joanne as the director of impact strategy and economic vitality at the Minneapolis Foundation. And her 30 years in philanthropy as an Ojibwe woman gives her an unprecedented expertise in this work. So we're very grateful for both of your leadership. Joanne?
Thank you, Ramona. Thank you so much. And want to say thank you for all the people that have registered to be part of this session today. It makes our hearts feel very, very joyful, and also gives us a sense of great responsibility when we're asked and called upon to bring forward a subject like this. And I do want to start out with just acknowledging, because I know there are some other relatives, other Indian relatives, Native relatives that are on this call. I just also want to acknowledge that we find this sometimes to be very difficult as part of our discussions, and that this can represent trauma and resurface in various ways. And for other relatives, this may trigger that as well when we talk about some of the things that we are going to bring forward today as part of this history, and why we're talking about this conversation about how we get land back into tribal ownership. I'm very delighted to step into this role in being the moderator for today's session, and also that I get the opportunity to work with Chris Stainbrook once again. Chris and I have a very long history going back over 30 years ago that goes back, I think, when we were with the St. Paul Foundation and helping them to launch a special fund that was supposed to be inclusive of all the communities of color. It was called the Diversity Endowment Funds. The St. Paul Foundation had asked us as people from each of our respective communities to help them to assist to create permanent endowments on behalf of our communities. And luckily, all four of our various groups decided that we can't do it all together at once. We have to do our own. And so Chris and I were one of those several of the four people that created the Two Feathers Endowment at the St. Paul Foundation. And so when I'm talking about 30 years, Chris, I think we can also say we're still here as well. We're very much still here.
And upright.
and still upright, correct. So this is kind of daunting when we're talking about a topic like this and how to present this and provide some type of context that relates to kind of the history and how this relates to our individual roles in philanthropy and how that ties into that. And then also to bring forward some recommendations of how we can address this particular topic. So we're going to do our best, and we're going to ask for your feedback to help us as we think about these next series that we were going to present going into the next year of 2023. But we're going to put up about 6 questions that are kind of specific to try to hit on some of the key points that relate to the history about us as Native peoples, how this relates to the land and where we are today. And we're going to ask you, Paul is going to put up the particular questions, and we'll take a few seconds for you to respond to the poll. And then we're going to provide a little context to that question and hopefully help you to kind of follow this thread as we go into the actual kind of conversation that we'll be having with Chris Stainbrook. So Paul, if you'd like to put, one more question. I mean, one more comment. I need to apologize for this. Chairman Larson sends his regrets. Originally, he was going to be part of this particular panel and representing, the Lower Sioux reservation and tribe, but wasn't able to be with us today. And again, I just thank Chris for saying that he would take this on all by himself, but he's fully capable in being able to do that. So with that, Paul, I'll ask you to put up that first question. So which of the following governs the United States and international law today? So if you could select your choice.
Joanne, are you seeing the questions right now?
I see the questions, but I don't see anyone polling.
So I wonder, my
Do I have
colleague,
to?
Susie, are you able to launch the poll if you click down at the bottom poll? I think one of my other colleagues maybe has control of the polls right now.
I see the poll and I see that people are participating in it.
Okay, good. I cannot see it.
So how do we know who's going to close it?
So unfortunately, I don't have control of it right now. And I wonder if any of my colleagues who are logged in from the MCF account could try hitting the next button on the poll.
You have to end the poll and then publish the results, it says. But who ends it? Susie can end it? Oh, there we are.
Hey.
Okay.
And Chris, can you see this?
Yes, I can.
All right. So the correct answer is the doctrine of discovery. I had 23%. Oh, I saw yes. Someone said yes. Right. So Paul, do you want to just give the kind of the background on that for individuals?
Yeah, so this one, we have a little bit that I'll read. Hopefully it spurs some interest and maybe you'll want to learn even more. But what I have here, so the US Constitution governs US law today. The Constitution recognizes Indian tribes as distinct governments, and tribal governments have, with a few exceptions, the same powers as federal and state governments to regulate their internal affairs. But it's the doctrine of discovery that governs US and international law today. So here's a little history. On May 4, 1493, Pope Alexander VI played a central role in the Spanish conquest of the New World. The Pope issued a document known as the Doctrine of Discovery, which supported Spain's strategy to ensure its exclusive right to the lands discovered by Columbus the previous year. The Pope's Doctrine of Discovery stated that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited by Christian rulers. The doctrine declared that the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that the barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. This doctrine of discovery became the basis of all European claims to the Americas, as well as the foundation for the Western expansion of the United States. In the US Supreme Court, in the 1823 case, Johnson versus McIntosh, Chief Justice John Marshall wrote the opinion for the unanimous decision. The Supreme Court decision stated that the principles of discovery gave European nations an absolute right to the New World lands. In essence, American Indians had only the right of occupancy, which could be abolished.
So, Chris, I know you've had many kind of thoughts and conversations about that, but is there anything particular that you'd like to just comment on for our members that are participating today about the doctrine of discovery?
Well, there's one of the things that's kind of just an interesting fact about it is the Pope actually divided the world in half and said this half can be discovered by Portugal and this half can be discovered by Spain. And that's why in Brazil they speak Portuguese, because the line went through the country. And so they ended up speaking Portuguese down there. Bob Miller from Lewis and Clark Law School, I think now he's at Arizona State University Law School, actually wrote a fairly lengthy piece on this. And we had him in town to do a talk, and he described when the land gets discovered, you had to have a bottle of brandy and a flag, and you would plant the flag and you would put the bottle of brandy next to it, and that meant you had ownership of it. And so that occurred 2 weeks after he was here. Russia went into the Arctic Ocean, went north because the ice had melted far enough, sent divers down, they planted a bottle of brandy and a flag and said they own it now. And that was as much ownership as you needed. And in the United States, that proved pretty disastrous for folks.
For me, it was the kind of the concept of Christianity, and as we think about the United States and some of the principles and where those come from, kind of that thread is comes across as being very strong. And then, Chris, as you talked about how you claim territory, I reflect back to, I remembered the landing on the moon where the flag was planted, but I'm not sure if they had the brandy. But again, kind of how this carries forward and how this gets part of it just becomes part of a system or part of a government. All right, Paul, let's move on to that second question.
Okay, so again, I don't have control right now.
Yep,
I'm hoping
I got
that
it.
Susie can.
I got it. I'm learning stuff here today. I know how to launch polls. Can everybody see it? Somebody give me the thumbs up. No? Yes. Okay, let's do it.
All right. How many times are Indians and tribes mentioned in the United States Constitution?
Okay, are more people interested in answering? Going once, going twice.
So the correct answer is 3 times.
All right, and a little bit of context on that answer. So 2 of the 3 mentions are found in Article 1 and the 14th Amendment. Both of those are places where the Constitution states that, quote unquote, Indians not taxed are excluded from the counts for apportioning direct taxes and representatives to Congress among the states. In the 3rd mention, in the Commerce Clause of Article 1, the Constitution grants to Congress the power to regulate commerce with the Indian tribes.
So again, Chris, out of those 3 three mentions, which kind of sticks out for you most when we're talking about this and how it relates to our tribal lands?
Well, the one that isn't mentioned here that's probably gotten new attention is what's called the Supremacy Clause. And it's right at the beginning, and it says treaties are the supreme law of the land. And the reason it's gotten a little more attention recently is the changes at the Supreme Court level, where you have supposed constitutionalists now in the majority on the Supreme Court. And if they're really constitutionalists, what does that mean in terms of the treaties, and are they truly the supreme law of the land? And the decision on the Dobbs case around abortion began to raise the question, if you can go back 50 years, can you go back 100 years? Can you use arguments from the 1300 as the Supreme Court did and say, we can reopen all of this law and none of it should have been made if the treaties are the supreme law of the land. So we're in some of those discussions now with people in DC about, do we go back and push this?
And then when it talks about regulating commerce.
Regulating commerce is an interesting one. It's been used the most. It says that Congress has the ability to regulate commerce between the several tribes and the several states. And so it begins to play out between not only the states, but the tribes and the states. And that becomes probably the most used clause in the Constitution as far as the tribes are concerned and Indian people. And it still plays out today. In fact, what's called the Intercourse Act was done in 1790, which was the precursor, or it's the follow-up to the Constitution in that regard, that says intercourse of any kind is regulated by Congress as far as the tribes are concerned. And they limit what you can do with even your fee land in Indian country.
All right, well, this will lead us into our third question. And this is, when did treaty making with Indian tribes end?
Okay, I'm gonna close the poll.
The correct answer is 1871. So from that, we're just going to move into the very next question. Keep that in mind, 1871 is when treaty making ended. When did Minnesota become a state?
Okay, you've got your results there, Joanne.
The correct answer is 1858. So this is a pretty knowledgeable group about Minnesota statehood. 1858. Paul?
All right, so just a little bit of context about what was happening with treaties and treaties broken during this time. So between 1837 and 1867, Dakota and Ojibwe bands negotiated approximately 16 treaties, specifically ceding land to the United States. 4 years after Minnesota became a state, in the summer of 1862. The Dakota were starving due to delayed annuity payments from the US government, coupled with crop failures and the refusal by traders and Indian agents to extend credit to the Dakota. During that summer, a war between the Dakota and the US lasted about 6 weeks. 400 Dakota men were tried and 303 were sentenced to death. US President Lincoln provided pardons except for 38 Dakota men.
Yeah, and I think the pardons were for 38 plus 2. So there were 2 additional that were hung later at Fort Snelling. But what's missing in this is the history that we can pull up and we can read, but what's missing in this, and I think the reason for these questions aren't really to make anyone feel bad, but it's really to amplify the amount of history that we're not taught in K-12, which is another part of what our K-12 task force is doing at We Are Still Here Minnesota. But what's not talked about and is even rarely known is that what happened to the women and children in our state. And it wasn't until 2016 that the Minnesota Historical Society Press put out a book called Fort Snelling at Bdote and talked about the death march of the Dakota, over 2,000 Dakota women and children, and a concentration camp where they were kept right there at Bdote. And the purpose of the book was not only to reveal the history, but to change the name of that place and honor the Dakota people. And that didn't happen. It didn't end up happening, but interesting that it not until 2016 was there a book published that used those words, genocide and concentration camp, because this reveal was going to happen. So they were kept there at Fort Snelling at the Bdote. So those are also some of those missing stories that we don't hear about our state history that's really important.
So again, and putting this in the context from the time frame back then, and also bringing it forward to now is very important as we think about this subject. So we've got 3 more quick questions, hopefully, that we can put up. The 15th Amendment passed in 1870, granted all US citizens the right to vote regardless of race, but it wasn't until 1924 this act was passed, where Indians now had the right to vote.
Okay, I'm going to close the poll. And here are the results.
So the correct answer is the Snyder Act. And again, this is, as we started off with some of the questions that are related to our Constitution, when we look into our Constitution and talking about rights that were provided to every individuals, again, for Native peoples, this did not happen until 1924. Next question, Paul.
You might also mention that it's also known as the Citizen Act, the American Indian Citizen Act.
So reservation land, this act authorizes the US president to break up reservation land, which was held in common by members of the tribe, into small allotments and to be parceled off to individuals. What is the name of that act?
Okay, I'm going to close the poll and here are the results.
So this was kind of a trick question. And it's a General Allotment Act or the Dawes Act. Chris is kind of smiling at me. So the majority of you were very correct in identifying that. In Minnesota, we had similar legislation that emulated that, and that was called the Nelson Act in Minnesota. All right, our final question, Paul. In what year did the allotment era, which is known as the Indian Reorganization Act, end that policy of allotment and authorize the Secretary of the Interior to restore remaining unallotted surplus, it's called surplus lands, to private ownership?
Okay, I'm closing the poll. And here are the results.
So 1934 is the correct answer. And again, and into citizens having the right to vote in 1924, 10 years later, we have this act ending the allotments, which is what we're going to kind of get into, I think, now with our next discussion and talking about restoration of Indian lands. And so this is where we're going to spend about the next 45 minutes and kind of conversation here and questions that I'll be asking, Chris about his role, kind of his history in this. And I want him just to kind of do a kind of more formal kind of introduction of himself and talking about himself, his interest in his family, and why his work at the Indian Land Tenure Foundation came about. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Padame, Wichasha Yapahe Chris Steinberg Amachiapi. That's the shortened version of the hello that Ramona gave you. It's also, if you recognize the southern drawl, it's because my mother's family is from the south end of Pine Ridge. The other thing, we're Lakota, and I'm always reminded when I'm on Dakota land, I wanted to get the hell out. So my family, when they moved, my grandfather moved his entire family off of the reservation after World War I, when he came home, and his allotment had been sold for tax purposes, because one of the things we should talk about related to allotment process, and it still haunts us today, is that there was really limited opportunity to retain your land if you were declared to be a competent Indian as opposed to an incompetent Indian. And so by joining the military, he became a competent Indian, and his land was moved from the trust status to fee status. And so he took his skills from World War I as a baker and moved to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and set up a bakery, and I grew up in central Iowa because of that, with the instructions from my grandfather and very much from my mother to never go back because there isn't anything there for us. And it was kind of internal strife in our family for a period of time. But I was asked not long ago, why do I do the work I do? And without thinking, I just blurted out, because of my grandfather. And so it's one of those things that, haunts me, and continues to haunt me today, that it took us the better part of 3 years to even find the allotment that had been given to him from his mother. And that shouldn't be the case. We should all know kind of our roots, I think. And so that's what kind of drives me now. The other thing that drives me is I'm not a land person by training necessarily. In fact, I have a master's degree in fisheries biology and worked for the tribes in the Pacific Northwest as a biologist. And at one of the meetings, I was complaining about, fisheries biology, and especially on the Columbia River where salmon are pretty contentious, is difficult because everyone's trying to kill the fish and you can't really count them until they're either dead or passing over a dam. And a leader from the Umatilla tribe says to me, well, if you think that's hard, you should try Indian land. And, the hubris of youth, I'm driving home that night and I'm thinking, well, that'll be simple. It's all in one place, doesn't move, should be able to get this done and back to biology fairly quickly. That was in 1987. Here I am still in Indian land. Someday I hope to go back to biology. So in the short term, in 1990, I came back to Minnesota for a lot of bad reasons, apparently. We moved back to Minnesota because my wife and I decided we were going to start a family, and Minnesota had great schools and a reputation of being a great place to live. We were living in Portland, Oregon at the time. They were closing schools left and right due to funding issues, wouldn't pass bond measures. We moved back to Minnesota. We moved to Forest Lake, told that they've never turned down a bond issue. First bond issue we're here, they turn it down. They haven't passed more than 2 since then. That's been 30 years. But it's been an interesting experience, I have to say. I came back, took the job at Northwest Area Foundation, and was there 13 years as a program officer, senior program officer. The foundation began to change its grant-making style and focus on fewer communities. That the board had decided it was better to concentrate the effort. And so they were looking for 10 different communities, and with fairly significant grants, with the communities pursuing their own plans developed by the communities. And of course, it took 2.5 years of planning at the board level to get to the point where they were ready to go. And we told them we'll come back in 3 board meetings out with a list of potential communities and detail on at least one of them. And they said, well, no, we've spent this much time planning, come back in 2 months with the list and pick the ones that you know the most about. And so we came back to the board with a list that included a community of interest. We had 4 communities of interest that we've been working with, including the Indian land community throughout the 8 states the Northwest Area Foundation serves. And they selected that one because we had some background in it. And so for 4 years, we did a planning process that involved about 1,200 Indian people in terms of getting comments from them about how best to address the Indian land issues in the region. And a group of 32 people put together the final plan, and it had passed through at least the initial stages of formation. It included the setting up of an entity that could be the kind of focus point for efforts from all of the other entities that were involved, including the tribes. And the initial board asked me to consider moving from Northwest Area Foundation over to what was to become the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. I told them I really wanted to see the program at Northwest Area Foundation through to the end, and as we were starting to select communities. And not unlike my history of quick decisions and then long histories, I had a bad week at Northwest Area Foundation, and they happened to call on the next Monday morning, and I said, yeah, okay. I no sooner had signed all the papers for my disclosures and conflicts of interest and everything, then I went back to my office, and Howard Malandra came in the office and said, I think I'm going to apply for that job at Indian Land Tenure Foundation. And so he and I partnered up, and we moved over to the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. And I've been here now 19 years and 9 months, and I'm still here. That's kind of the background and the history of it. The interesting thing, I don't know necessarily how the other communities that Northwest Area Foundation selected have worked out, but from our perspective, this has worked pretty well in the sense that we've now put out about $115 million out into the Indian community on land issues, both through program work, direct grants, and then also investments. And that's something that we can talk about some more of how that got structured and how we put together the things. One of the things that I would comment off of Ramona's comment about curriculum, we have Indian land curriculum. When we started, we sat down and said, okay, how do movements in this country get started? And we decided, you look at them, recycling, non-smoking, a whole host of those come from kids. And so we decided we would put together a land curriculum and at least inform people about land issues, Indian land issues. And so we built a curriculum from kindergarten to 12th grade. Now it's taught in about 2,500 different schools. And then we had a proposal from some folks at Rosebud for a coloring book for preschool. So we have a coloring book for preschool. We have, now we've got, I think, 18 tribal colleges teaching about half of that curriculum. And it's been used in the Montana Indian Education for All, the state curriculum. It's been used in South Dakota and Washington State as well. So that was an emphasis of ours and still remains largely an emphasis of ours. Just having gone through the survey you just took, it's impressive that you did as well on it as you did, because it's not a history that has been taught. And as I look at the pictures on the screen, I can tell none of you have been through our curriculum. So, it's always interesting to see what people remember about the Indian education they got in schools. And usually it comes the day before Thanksgiving, involves some type of either chicken feathers or paper mache feathers and a pilgrim hat somewhere along the line. And so we encourage folks, teachers, to at least teach one of the lessons during the day before, if nothing else, and we get a pretty good response to that. All in all, it's it's been an interesting time for me personally, in that there's virtually a week, and maybe even as much as 2 or 3 times a week, I'm completely surprised by the stories we get told by Indian people on their land or about their land, or what their issues are in terms of managing and operating and using their land. And literally it's a continual stream of things I've never heard about Indian country before. And so when you think you really have a handle on Indian land, and trust me, I've been hip deep in it for almost 35 years of my life. It's surprising that it's all over out there. The one thing I would say before I get too far into this is I think it was Samuel Clemens who said, "No generalization is worth a damn, not even this one." And that's true of Indian country and Indian land. We have 565 recognized tribes now in the United States, federally recognized tribes, and probably another 25 to 35 state recognized tribes. And they all come with a different history. They all come with a different land history. And so it's difficult to even kind of broadly generalize about what land is about. The other thing I'd say is what Will Rogers once said, which was, don't waste too much time on yesterday, today. And so that's my history. And I could answer questions if you want, but I just soon get to your questions as well. But I know Joanne's got some more for me.
Yeah. So as we talk about the Indian Land Tenure Foundation and its creation and your handwriting and all the thought behind that, and it's now almost been 20 years, and you are a national foundation in providing support to tribes in the recovery and land back issues. And you talked about, creating a curriculum. You've also created the Indian Land
Capital Company.
Indian Land Capital Company as part of some of the strategies to do that. And I know that again represents things that are nationally. So if you can kind of talk about both that national kind of focus and how many acres, I just want you to let people know what we're talking about for the land that was lost and what we're trying to recover. And then how you bring that then to here kind of in Minnesota with our 11 tribal nations and some of the work that's happening here as well.
Well, so when the foundation was put together by the initial planning board, the goal is to get 90 million acres of land that was lost during the allotment process back in Indian ownership, management, and control. And then some of the historic sites that have cultural importance to the tribe still, to get those back in management and ownership and control. That's our mission statement. To go back for a moment to the allotment process. So in 1887, the decision was made by Henry Dawes. He was a senator out of Connecticut who decided Indian people should be farmers and ranchers, much in the European model. And so the conclusion was we'll give 160 acres to all the head of households. And that way they can be, Europeans more or less. But it was also a way to diminish the power of the tribes. And so those reservations that went through the allotment process, in order to even take the ownership of the allotment, they had to sign up on the Dawes rolls, and that would happen. And then in some cases, people got to pick out where their allotment was going to be on the reservation. In other cases, in fact, in most cases, they were assigned by the superintendent. If you had a favorable superintendent, you got to at least have a discussion. The long and short of it is the federal government also decided that Indian people were incompetent to handle their land because they hadn't owned land in the European sense before that. And so they declared a blanket statement, all Indian people incompetent to handle their affairs, and included the tribes in that blanket statement, and took all of the land into trust. So the federal government actually owns the land, holds it for individuals and or the tribes in a trust status, and for the beneficial use of those folks that they're holding it for. 160 acres on some number of reservations didn't include all of the land. And so the remainder of the land was then declared in excess of Indian needs and taken. That was about 60 million acres. In many ways, that was the major loss. The subsequent loss came through the declaration of people declared competent. As I was telling you, my grandpa was, when he joined the service, was then declared competent to handle his own affairs, but no one told him his land had gone from trust to fee status. And fee status is, as most other people would own land, it's under the county jurisdiction and therefore can be taxed. And his land was taxed and then sold at the county courthouse steps for tax forfeiture. And there were another 30 million acres that went that route. And well, that was 20 million, and then another 10 we lost through direct sales. There's a whole history of, in 1906, the federal government decided that there were people who should be off of the trust status, mostly in Oklahoma. And so they set up what are called competency commissions to go out and determine whether an Indian was competent or not. And if they were declared competent, then their land transferred from trust to fee status and could be sold. And I think some of you have probably heard the stories out of Oklahoma, where a lot of Indian women married non-Indian men and were declared competent. Didn't work the other way around. If an Indian man married a white woman, he wasn't declared competent, largely because white women at the time were considered chattel, at least one step above Indians. And so what would happen is that Indian woman, we had hundreds and hundreds of Indian women meeting these untimely deaths. And once they had gotten title to their land, and then that went over to their non-Indian spouse. So it's those kind of things that largely have this history that lives with us even today from the allotment process. Even today, to have your land in trust status means you're an incompetent Indian. And they even have a form at the Bureau of Indian Affairs that they've changed the wording so it doesn't say, "Are you incompetent?" It asks you a few questions about pieces that should allow you to, if you answer the questions correctly, you can have your land put into trust. But if you show any amount of competence, they will resist taking your land into trust. But it's the only way we have right now to protect that land from county and state jurisdiction on the reservation, and also from county taxes. Let me see if I can do this real quick. I'll show you. Maybe I can't. Oh, there it is. I'll show you a couple of things from, this is Minnesota. I just have a couple of slides to show you. This is the original sessions that went on. Can you see that okay?
You have to hit share screen.
And I tried that. Let me see if I can get out of here now. Put that down. Yeah, it's not letting me get there, I don't think. Yeah, I think I need permission from someone to do it. Oh, wait.
There
Now
it
can
is.
you see it? Okay.
Starting. Something's happened.
Good.
There you go. Leech Lake. Yeah. Okay.
Yep. So this is, can you see this one?
Yes.
So these are the treaties that Joanne was talking about earlier, and you can see how they kind of march from east to west, making the agreements. I would tell you, we got pulled into a discussion by Mona Smith's husband, Marty Case, and he said, I've been looking at all these treaties for a birthday present, and I keep seeing the same white names over and over, not the Indian names, but the same white ones on all these. And so we had him do a little work, and then that grew into a bigger piece. And we have now a website that has the history of all the treaty signers, both Indian and non-Indian, for across the country. And one of the things you find is most of the treaties were just economic transactions. oftentimes it would be a family of the father, the sons, the brother-in-laws, a whole host of folks, and they would just move across the country accumulating more land. And similarly in Minnesota, you saw the same thing. To give you a sense of what the, there we go. To give you a sense of what the allotment process ended up like. And I have to tell you, Minnesota is interesting in and of itself when it comes to the tribes and the treaties and all the other pieces, because you have essentially small areas that were once considered reservations have been eliminated completely. You have tribes that have gone through the allotment process, and you have Red Lake, which is wholly owned by the tribe still and did not go through the allotment process. If I go up here to Leech Lake, this is the Leech Lake Reservation. So on this map, you can see it's all considered Leech Lake, and it's a big red dot right there at Leech Lake around the lakes, and gives you the impression, as do most road maps, that Leech Lake is wholly owned by Indian people. This is the actual Leech Lake Reservation as it exists today. The reservation boundaries, of course, are still largely intact, but the interior is all basically gone. In fact, Leech Lake only owns about 3.5, maybe 4% of the land. The yellow on there is a national forest. When they opened it up to in excess of Indian needs, there apparently wasn't enough demand from timber companies and others to take the whole thing. So it remained in the federal estate and became the national forest. The blue lands are the state forests. And these were lands that were established at the same time, and then also have been used as consolidation of lands outside by the national forest with the state forest. Primarily, those lands were school lands. And then here I'll show you make it stand out a little bit. The red dots on here are what remain in Indian ownership and or tribal ownership. And you can see it's right around, I think now 4%. This is probably, we use this map as one of the most egregious outcomes of the allotment process in the country. There is probably no other reservation you'll find that has so little Indian land left on it.
Chris, what is the amount of the total acreage that 4% represents what out of how many acres?
About
there?
Well, yeah, you've got it there on this
Okay.
side now. These numbers need to be updated some. We help provide Leech Lake. We provided them with 3 grants to look at the history of the takings that were sold illegally under what was called a secretarial order. They called them secretarial transfers. It was illegal. And Leech Lake pursued it in Congress in 2 years. Well, it's been almost 3 years now. Donald Trump signed it the week before he left office, or about 2 weeks before he left office. But he signed 17,000 acres of the national forest back over to Leech Lake ownership. But you can see that only ups it by maybe 1%. There are other pieces on here. For instance, we did a transaction with Lower Sioux, which added another 1,200 acres to their total. And then most recently, you may have seen in the popular press, we were involved in financing 28,000 acres from Potlatch-Deltic Corporation to the Boys Fort Band, which accounts for about 25% of their Net Lake reservation. So these numbers are a little bit behind, but you can get a sense of how much land was lost in Minnesota by the tribes. The other thing that complicates all this is the Nelson Act. And the Nelson Act was actually set up to move all of the Indian people from all the Chippewa people from their other reservations over to White Earth. And one of the things you'll see at White Earth that you don't see anywhere else is they have what are called the Chippewa tribal lands. And they aren't owned by the White Earth Band, or they're in the process of being transferred to the White Earth Band. But the majority of land that was held by tribes and individuals were supposed to all be on White Earth, and all the other reservations were to go away after the allotment process. That hasn't occurred, but the bands, the Minnesota Ojibwe, are quite interested in recovering their lands, and especially a place like Leech Lake, where it's so devastating not to have the land. One of the things that we see, I mean, land underlies a large amount of what goes on the reservations in terms of economic development, as well as just revenues coming onto the reservations. Too often we've heard that, well, Leech Lake ought to be doing so much better with all the land they have. And then you really look at the map and it's not. It makes you wonder, why isn't the National Forest doing better than it is? Or why isn't the state forest doing better than it is? But it's a real impediment. And that, I'm not even scratching the surface on what the trust relationship means. If you want to do something with your land and it's in trust, you have to go to the Secretary of Interior to get approval. So if you want to lease, you have to have an approval. If you want to build on it, you have to have an approval. It's quite constraining. And the thing we still live with today, and this is important especially for the Ojibways, when they set up the allotment process, they didn't have a process for what happens when they pass. And so land was in kind of limbo after the passing until 1906. And then a bill was passed that said, all right, we're going to use the state probate services and land will be divided that way. And then someone said, well, no, the land shouldn't be divided because it's held in trust, and therefore they had to set up a federal process, and the federal process was to keep the land intact, but divide the title among the heirs. And so in the first round, you might have, let's say you had 6 kids, one interest would be divided among the 6. And then as time went on and the generations went on, you had increasingly more and more owners in 160 acres, to the point today where we have literally thousands of owners on some pieces of land that's 160 acres. In fact, there's one allotment up at Lakuta Ray that's got about 5,000 owners in an 80-acre tract. It's a nightmare, and it led to the other. I don't want to go too deep in this, but the other thing that happens is you don't get the money directly. So you've probably, some number of you have heard the old saying, well, every Indian gets a federal check. Well, what happens is if you had an allotment and got a lease payment, that went to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who then sent it to the Department of Treasury, who divided it among all the owners on that tract, and then they would mail out checks all at the same time. And so people would see all these federal checks coming. Well, it was the individual Indian money accounts send a check that was causing that to happen, and the revenues all coming from their own land. It's a morass that you can't fully grasp until you end up having to work with some of it.
So Chris, I know this is a lot to try to understand, and it is very complex, and we recognize that in the beginning. But we did discuss before, this session that, what can we do as people that are working in philanthropy to kind of help address this issue here? We're specifically thinking about in Minnesota. What do you see that's kind of working, kind of some of those opportunities where there can be this investment in helping with that recovery or transfer of lands? And using Leech Lake, for example, I mean, you have a lot of federal lands that are still there. You have a lot of state lands that are there. And then you have individual people who own land. And then I think for us in philanthropy too, it's also, and what do we have? What do we have any type of ownership, or what can we do to help in that process? Give us, some type of, suggestions, what you've seen that's worked. As I said, it gets very complex, but kind of help guide us kind of through this. In the, couple 10 minutes or so that we have remaining before we can open this up for questions.
I think, earlier when Joanne, when you and I talked about having the session, and you asked what's the most effective way that you get land back, and it's through willing seller, willing buyer. And the Indian Land Capital Company, we set that up so that tribes could finance land purchases in a more equitable way. So the banks and other financing instruments were basically convincing the tribes that they were bad credit risks. And Eloise and I said, well, the tribes aren't going to default on this. If they get land back, they aren't going to default on it. And so we set up Indian Land Capital Company as a for-profit entity so that so no one would confuse it with grants. And they lend to the tribes on full faith and credit. We don't take land as collateral. But the thing that makes it most efficient in getting land back is the ability to act quickly on when something comes up and it gets identified, whether it's like the Boys Fort is a good example. The trust or the conservation fund had worked out the deal with PotlatchDeltic, and when they came to us, we were able to do the financing to buy the conservation fund out of that 28,000 acres and move that to the Boys Fort Band. The other, and that one's actually helped by our other program, which is National Indian Carbon Coalition. And so the carbon credit sales for that land will end up actually buying and paying for the entirety of the 28,000 acres and the financing we put in. But the most effective and efficient way to help the tribes get the land back is that ability to react quickly. And we've done that across the country, basically. I think maybe in, 12 different states, we've had projects with different tribes that took advantage of avoiding auctions and that sort of thing on land. I think there's plenty of opportunities that arise. We have Indian Land Capital Company at any given time has about a $60 million backlog in good loans that could be made if we had the capital for that. We're working with Margaret Cargill right now on a grant to help us emulate a model out of First Nations in Canada, which will allow us to access larger amounts of capital at a time. The other thing, and I tell this to a lot of the church groups that I meet with, is it's not so much the money, it's the understanding we want. We want people to be aware of what the situation is, and that it's not an easy situation either for Indian people or for the tribes, but it's also not an easy situation for the citizens of the area either. And so it's how do you understand that, and what does it mean, in a program area, or just being aware and telling others. that's as important to us as money. Because oftentimes, and especially with foundations, oftentimes you can get drawn into something that you don't realize that it has an effect on the local tribe or their land. And I think having folks more aware of what it looks like. Our organization, we're known as hardliners on sovereignty for the tribes. And a lot of foundations fund the big conservation groups who then go and buy the land both on the reservation and or important pieces off of it, but then put conservation easements on it and then want the tribe to take over the land. But by doing the conservation easement, you've essentially weakened the tribal sovereignty because they no longer have decision-making over that property. And so we don't get involved with those transactions if we can avoid them in any way. But it's things like that of being aware and asking yourself, well, what does this mean to the tribe? I also would take this opportunity to suggest, if you're funding in Minnesota, get to know the Minnesota tribes. You don't need to go through a place like the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. Get to know them and work directly with them. They're easy folks to get along with, trust me. The first time you come, they may just look at you, but the second time you come, you'll be their friend.
So, Chris, again, thinking about a role for philanthropy, and I know this is something that with the Northwest Area Foundation, clearly had an understanding of where their wealth was generated from and the railroads and going across Indian country, kind of why those 8 states kind of represent that. I think that's a step of discovery, perhaps that can be recommended to anyone here representing philanthropy to kind of understand. So where does that wealth of philanthropy come from? And I don't know if there was a process that you could recommend for people to do that. It doesn't have to be the whole institution. It could be a person that's here that has an interest that wants to find out more about this and then think about how they might be able to elevate that within their own foundation. But can you talk just a little bit about that when you're talking about know yourself first before you decide to go find out about somebody? I think would be a good recommendation.
Well, I think people thought that Northwest Area Foundation got in it because of some white guilt or something. That wasn't that at all. It was really much more around community development and having the tribes on equal footing and Indian people on equal footing in terms of development. Now, it turns out that, yes, most of the funds for the foundation got generated out of the Great Northern Railroad. And in fact, one of the grandsons was on the board at Northwest Area Foundation at the time, and we had long discussions about it. But I think if you look across the country, pretty much everything has been developed on Indian land, and it's been taken one way or the other, either through the treaties. There are some that are more egregious than others, and I think you need to really think about what's equitable. There's no way to make up for what we lost in Indian country, but there are ways to make it a little more equitable in terms of development. And the guy who made $9 million off of the Kentucky Derby made $9 million in one day because of the Kentucky Derby. It was his family that did the treaty that basically gave them ownership of Tennessee and Kentucky. It was a treaty that they had written themselves into and got it passed. That guy I would like to have seen $9 million come to Indian country. But, I think every foundation is somewhat different. But those that that, you know, made their largesse off of Indian country directly should really think hard about how do we do this right? And how do we return some of it?
I just want to kind of point out, again, with Northwest Area Foundation, I think you were also, you know, very intentional and with your intentions on who was going to be also on your board. And I do want to mention Eloise Gabel as being a board member, and the importance of her leadership and other tribal leadership that helped guided the Northwest Area Foundation, but is also kind of responsible for elevating the issue of land, individual money accounts, the fractionation, what was happening at the federal level in her case as well. Can you just mention that kind of very, very quickly about the legislative side, on a legal side, on challenging the United States government and its practices?
Well, I think that's, I mean, Eloise was a champion in that regard. And we won't see another person like Eloise. And Eloise was not afraid of the fight. And people kept telling her, you don't really want to sue the federal government for the largest amount they've ever been sued for. And that became a challenge for Eloise, was to not only sue them, but to win. And she won three trials. They finally had to remove the judge because he had gotten to the point where he thought the Department of Interior should just go away. And so they replaced him with another judge who soft pedaled his way out of the thing. But there's, you know, as the Office of Hearings and Appeals, the people who do federal probate, I sat and had lunch with the head judge, and he said to me, you know, Chris, there are any number of Cabell suits waiting in Indian country because this stuff has just gone on for too long, and Indian people keep paying, and you need to change a lot of this. And so I would say I spend probably right now 60 to 70% of my time working with people in DC on major land issues that need to change in Indian country. And having additional voices outside of Indian country to say, yeah, this needs to change would be really helpful to us.
So I do want to point out one thing about this, and we're starting to get some questions, and I do want to leave about 10 minutes for questions in the chat, or just open questions. But again, for a role for philanthropy, when I mentioned again with Eloise Cabell and mentioning that she was on the Northwest Area Foundation board, when Eloise started, you know, her legal actions, philanthropy stepped up and provided funding and grants to do that. I don't know if you just briefly can say something about that, Chris.
Yeah, actually, excuse me. Actually, Northwest Area Foundation put in the first $1 million in the lawsuit to support it. Bremer came in for, I think, $600,000 or $800,000 behind that. Eloise eventually raised on the order of about $12 million from foundations to support it. We raised some money to help. Once the settlement was done, we raised money from Ford Foundation and Lannan Foundation to help support the attorneys and Eloise going around Indian country to make sure everyone knew what the settlement was about and why they were going to settle, as opposed to continue pushing the lawsuit. That was in the 16th year of the lawsuit that it finally settled. She had literally thousands and thousands of hours of attorney time that was both contributed and paid for by foundations. And so it's one of those things, and that was not in Northwest Area Foundation's program work at that point, to do that kind of legal work. But there's a lot foundations can do that don't go right directly to the court. I mean, it's like the work we did with Leech Lake with 3 grants. That was, you know, sorting through the history and getting to a point where the tribe could carry it forward, but they needed to have all the background and information collected as concisely as possible. So there are opportunities like that that are not direct litigation that foundations could really do by thinking a little bit out of the box with the tribes on
Well, we'd like out of the box for sure.
it.
I want to get to, to some of the questions. Paul, do you want to bring those up?
I see one question right now, just asking how often is land given back to tribes rather than sold?
Pretty irregularly. I told somebody the other day, we haven't had this much interest in Indian country since Dances with Wolves came out. It's one of those things that it's up and down, and I think, well, and then the folks who did the hashtag thing, I have to tell you, they didn't do us a lot of favors because everybody and their brother thinks that Indian people will want their land. So I have, sitting on my desk right now, I have 4 farms in Iowa that the farmers don't have heirs to, and they want to give it to the Indians, as it were. The tribes don't want it because they can't manage it. They're not close to Meskwaki. They come with management costs and taxes that the tribes will have to pay. And if you can't manage it and use it, just getting it back isn't going to do it. And so I have to tell them, this is what's likely going to happen if you really want to contribute it to the tribes. They're probably going to sell it. They're going to take the proceeds from it, and they're going to buy land closer to the reservation. And then they can use it. It's one of those things where, yeah, would it be nice to have it all back? Yeah, it'd be nice to have it all back, but there are realities to the situation. There have been a few governmental entities that have returned land without sales. There's a was it Ephrata or Eureka, California? The city had an island that they didn't know what they were ever going to do with, so they gave that back. We helped facilitate a transfer from a county in Washington State to a tribe. And maybe this is an example of acting quickly. The county said the tribe could have the land if they would maintain the park that was on it. And so we bought them a pickup truck and a lawnmower, and the tribe got the land back. So sometimes it's out of the box a little ways.
Again, I said, love out of the box. We've got a few more minutes left, and I do want to open this up and maybe ask for some of our other funders that are here, if they have any stories or anything that they could share with their work and working with tribes and getting land back. I know I think I saw Northland Foundation, some of the initiative foundations. I know that Bush is on here. Is there anyone that would like to share something? Eric, can you share anything about your experience in working on land issues with the tribes?
I would say that, Northland Foundation, we haven't, worked specifically around, land issues with tribes per se. I think where we're at right now is really trying to be mindful of the engagement that we do with tribal nations, sort of upholds, strengthens sovereignty and doesn't erode it. And, very much kind of building relationships. So, I think we've sort of had a practice the last, several years of saying yes, right, about, sort of acting first, act and then contemplate, and so like not really sure about, what does this potential work, look like, but let's do some things and then you know, and then kind of reflect and kind of see how that worked. And so, you know, I think like that's been useful in the relationship building. You know, for instance, the planning director at Fond du Lac, who just recently kind of went off our board, was like, you know, we used to all get together, all the planning directors from the 11 nations in Minnesota, but that's kind of gone by the wayside. You know, is there a way that, you know, you can support that happening again? And so, you know, we contracted with a consultant firm that kind of does all the work about pulling these folks together, and yeah, that's been happening. You know, it's happened a couple of times, and so I think like for us, you know, the out of the box habit, you know, makes sense. You know, resonates with kind of what's needed, and about, you know, there's a lot of, you know, there's not necessarily a lot of reason for, you know, for tribal nations to trust philanthropy, and for sure, you know, I think it makes sense to try to figure out, you know, how to be creative, how to, you know, get rid of a lot of our own rules that might, you know, hamper them kind of getting access to it. So those are just off the top of my head a couple of the things that I'd recommend. And, you know, and eventually we may end up doing some land work with them, but we haven't done that directly yet.
Thank you. Kyle, did you want to say anything?
I sure can. Having been on both sides of this, guys, the advancement director at Leech Lake Tribal College for 10 years, and now I've been at Blandin Foundation for 8.5. The best advice I can give is to spend time in the community with people. Don't try to do this from your office. Relationship development is super important. As Eric just said, there are a lot of good reasons for people to not, or to at least be a little skeptical maybe of folks from the outside. And it's going to take a little while and some, you know, honest conversation to get to the real story and the real needs and the real opportunities. And I know our schedules get full and it can be a challenge, but where you prioritize your budget and where you prioritize your time really says a lot about, you know, what you really value. And an investment in relationship development will absolutely pay off. And there are plenty of good projects out there to be funded regardless of what your foundation's focus is. So get out, get in community, learn about what's going on, and find reasons to, not reasons not to.
And then I'll ask Sarah, is there anything that you'd like to share? Have you had any experiences from the Northwest Minnesota Foundation?
I was just reflecting to myself that I'm pretty new at the Northwest Minnesota Foundation. I've been here a year. In my knowledge, we have not done any land work with any of the tribes. You know, we within our region up here, we cover Red Lake Nation and White Earth Nation, and we're very close to Leech Lake. So I'm sorry I don't have anything that I can really share except the reflection both from Kyle and Eric. Our little team here has been talking a lot about relationship building with our tribal cohort and our peers, and just rebuilding trust between us, making sure that we can have those open conversations and not going in thinking that we know what needs to happen. So Nate is on the call as well, and we've been doing a lot of visiting recently and just trying to keep our ears open and asking what do they need and what can we do instead of making assumptions.
Oh, that's great.
This has been a great hour though. Thank you.
You're welcome. I just want to acknowledge Karen with the Southwest Initiative Foundation has put some information in the chat. I don't know if you just want to jump in very quickly and say something further, Karen.
Sure. I would just offer on the note of relationship building, we've specifically contracted with our historic preservation officers. So to really look at how are we compensating for what we're asking in terms of support in our learning journey, and how that's been a formal way to build those relationships. And I think just on the personal front, a way that we continue to build really strong relationships with people that we've worked with for a long time, but are learning to work with in new and different, and I think exciting ways on both sides.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you so much for spending about an hour and a half with us today. Again, as I said, on a very complicated, very deep subject. There'll be more to come. And we appreciate you spending this time with us today. And I hope you all have a very safe journeys as you go home and maybe not have to fight the snow that we had to do this in the Twin Cities, but really appreciate this huge response that this is wonderful. And as I said, we will send out a survey, ask you for some comments, what you'd like to see next in our various series of things to cover. We may have to do another one on Indian land issues as well. I'd like to thank Chris for taking this all on by himself today. He's been traveling for the last 6 weeks. So I do really appreciate the work that you've been doing for the last 20 years, almost celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. I told Chris this would be a good time to raise a lot of money. So having said that, I'd like to say on behalf of We Are Still Here with Sarah and with Ramona, and also thanking again Susie and Paul in helping us put together. I wish you all a very good day, rest of the day, and safe travels. So thank you so much.